time. I'm really excited for this talk. This is one of my academic heroes and somebody whose books have really inspired me over the past couple years. Coming up next, we have a presentation. From Wendy Chun. Wendy Hui Kyung Chun is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media and leads the Digital Democracies Institute. She's the author of several works, including Discriminating Data, which is forthcoming this year, and more, and three other books at MIT Press, including Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, Programmed Vision, Software and Memory, and finally, my personal favorite, Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics. This book was really instrumental in all of the framing of this festival, from the really realist approach that she takes to this dynamic between the possibility and the limitation of new media. She has been professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, where she worked for almost 2 decades. And she has held numerous visiting chairs and fellowships from institutions such as Harvard, the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the Guggenheim, ACLS, and American Academy of Berlin. She is also PI on several grants, including one from the UK-Canada AI Initiative. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Wendy and hear more about her latest work.
Hello everyone! I'm very excited to be here as part of the Gray Area Festival and to offer you a sneak preview of my forthcoming book, Discriminating Data. Today I'm speaking to you from my home in Boston, so I want to acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc peoples. And I extend my respect to the citizens of these nations who live here today and their ancestors who have lived here for over 500 generations. I also want to acknowledge that my land acknowledgement, like all others, is a small gesture. A small gesture that in Canada, at least, is part of an ongoing truth and reconciliation process. A process, however flawed and faltering, and believe me, it is flawed and faltering, to face the violent truths of settler colonialism, such as the horrific residential school system. A process to move towards decolonization, reparations, and reconciliation. A process of reconciliation that speaks to some of the aims of this year's Gray Area Festival. To imagine new relational ontologies beyond utopian and fatalistic worldviews, to build practical realities together, to build planetary scale cooperation and solutions that move beyond technological promises. Because relying on purely technological promises is and has been and will always be a dead end. A dead end in which anything is possible, yet nothing seems to change. And what I'll outline today is this sense that anything is possible, yet nothing seems to change, which the festival organizers emphasize isn't accidental. If nothing seems to change, it's because social media networks and predictive programs, as they're currently formed and implemented, embed within themselves past mistakes such as segregation, internment, and eugenics. And by doing so, they make it difficult to live and to imagine different worlds. Okay, so to make this clear, let's engage in a collective thought experiment. So imagine or recall an image of a mythic yet flawed past. I'll supply a few. Here's the so-called perfect white suburban nuclear family living in a segregated planned community in which everything's the same. Here are images of US celebrities, which are the training set for many facial recognition systems. And here are images of Japanese American children allegedly happily educated in internment camps during World War II. So imagine that this deep fake past has become the only past, right? So gone are images of civil rights protests, integrated schools, and cross-racial friendships. Now imagine a world and nothing could change from this deep fake past because learning and truth became repeating this deep fake past. Got it? This is the nightmare scenario of predictive machine learning. This is the world that we need, to use Ariella Azoulai's terms, to unlearn. To unlearn not by ignoring history, but by engaging it differently and potentially. Because within these concepts and defaults lie other worlds and possibilities. And helping us listen to these other worlds, as Kara Keeling urges us to do, is what drives discriminating data. So, most generally, discriminating data explores how data analytics and machine learning create agitated clusters of comforting rage by encoding legacies of eugenics, segregation, and discrimination. By taking on these issues, discriminating data is in dialogue with the many recent books and articles written by Cathy O'Neill, Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, Meredith Broussard, Kate Crawford, Virginia Eubanks, and so many others. Discriminating data does 5 basic things. The first is to expose and investigate how ignoring differences amplifies discrimination. So how ignoring race ignorantly promotes racism. And every day we hear about a new instance of what Cathy O'Neill has called a weapon of mass destruction, Sophia Noble has called algorithms of oppression, and Ruha Benjamin has called the new Jim Code. From discriminatory predictive policing and risk assessment programs to unfair hiring programs. And the classic example of this, which almost everybody mentions, is COMPAS. COMPAS is a software program used by some US courts to predict the risk of recidivism. So inmates and law enforcement fill out a questionnaire, and COMPAS spits out a score based on their answers. And the score is factored in by some courts during sentencing and parole. Now the problem is that COMPAS has been shown to be biased against racial minorities. And here you see the cover of the award-winning ProPublica article on COMPAS. Now what researchers whom ProPublica drew from were able to show is that although COMPAS doesn't overtly use racial categories, doing so is illegal, it uses categories that are proxies for race in the United States. And here you see an analysis produced by the Marshall Project, and here you see how race is linked to factors such as education and employment. Now, some have argued that these factors aren't as important as others, that age and dirty data play a larger role than these proxies. But this doesn't mean that COMPAS's predictions aren't racist. If you consider the over and under policing of certain neighborhoods in the United States and Canada, age at time of arrest and dirty data, you have to be in the database in order to be miscribed, as well as education and employment status, are proxies for racism, if not race. And it's absolutely key that we think through proxies for racism. Crucially, COMPAS was initially sold as solving the problem of racism by eradicating individual human bias, as if racism was an individual human bias problem. So we shouldn't be surprised that things have turned out so poorly. And rewriting political and social problems as one's technology can and should solve never goes well. This hopeful ignorance isn't new, and the failures of this hopeful ignorance aren't new. These hopes and failures also drive fears over the AI apocalypse. AI is so threatening because right now, AI and surveillance devices are sold as modern-day servants or slaves. And this framing, with all of its baggage, right? So what could go wrong in a society run by servants or slaves? Provokes fears of them as our masters. These fears and dreams are, as Jenny Rhee has pointed out, profoundly raced and gendered. And one thing I do in the book is to address these two sides of hopeful ignorance together, because the best way to avoid an AI apocalypse is to treat everyone and everything with respect, to follow the Combahee River Collective's call to treat everyone as levelly human, and to follow the Indigenous Protocol's call for us to make kin with our machines. Because freedom is only freedom if it's freedom for all. And what we have to remember is that these current anxieties over AI and discriminatory algorithms can open up opportunities for coalitions and political action. Civil rights and civil liberties groups, for instance, came together to take on facial recognition technology. The second thing discriminating data does is to interrogate default assumptions and axioms that ground algorithms and data structures. So very briefly, because it's impossible to summarize 5 years of research into 20 minutes, in the book I map out how overblown promises about correlation ties 21st century data analytics to early 20th century eugenics. I also show how homophily, the notion that similarity breeds connection, ties social networks to US residential segregation, so that echo chambers aren't an accident, they're a goal. In fact, as I'll discuss a little more later, the very term homophily, which launders hate into love, comes from studies of post-World War II US residential segregation. So segregation here is the ground truth and the goal of these recommender systems. I also look how authenticity, how deviations and transgressions ground training and transparency. So right now we're constantly called on to be authentic by revealing some intimate yet open secret about us. An open secret that makes us different from some others, that makes us real. And these open secrets are valuable because they're used to cluster us, to put us in network neighborhoods with people like us who agitate and charge us. And one of my main points is that networks magnetize and disintegrate masses by divining and amplifying open secrets, and then consolidating these angry clusters of sameness around a common enemy. So that now we become predictable, not by following the mainstream, not by following norms, but rather by deviating slightly from the norm with others. And lastly, discriminating data looks at how recognition, from facial recognition technology to the radical right's embrace of the politics of recognition, builds on discrimination, on a powerful and poisonous liberation envy, so that those who seek to deny others their civil rights now disidentify with and as civil rights heroes. The third thing I do is try to grasp the past, present, and future machine learning puts in place by focusing on when, why, and how their predictions work. What's key again is that in machine learning, truth equals consistency, the future equals the past. In other words, learning is parsimonious repetition. So the problem with machine learning as it currently exists, isn't simply that it's often trained on dirty or highly selective data. Again, Hollywood celebrities lie at the heart of many facial recognition technology training sets. And here you see so-called deep fakes produced using this set. The problem isn't simply, as this example of Hollywood stars as ground truth makes clear, that ground truth equals deep fake, but that these so-called predictive programs are verified as true only if they reproduce this data. So COMPAS, like all predictive machine learning programs, wasn't tested on its ability to predict the future, but rather validated on its ability to predict the past. So past data that was hidden during the training phase or out of set data. So in these models, truth equals consistent repetition. And this matters because these programs don't simply predict the future, they also determine the future. So risk assessments and software such as COMPAS cement and amplify inequalities through their decisions. So that these programs These programs are disruptive if they are, not because they make possible new unforeseen futures, but because they shut down the future. They make it repeat a deep fake past by automating rather than learning from past mistakes. Okay, so if this is so, what can we do? Well, step 4 is to use existing AI systems to diagnose current inequalities. To keep the future open, to create a more just and democratic future, we need to be a little perverse. We need to read the discriminatory results of these algorithms against the grain as evidence of past discrimination. Amazon, for example, stopped using its secret hiring algorithm a few years ago because it was shown to discriminate against women. Apparently, if you had women anywhere in your CV, like Women's Chess Club, you lost points. But rather than simply discarding these programs, and they certainly should not be used to determine hiring decisions, what if we use them as evidence, right? So almost every Amazon hiring decision during a certain period was probably used to train this program. So what if we thank them for meticulously documenting their discrimination? What if we use these programs with all their limitations as historical tools, as theoretical probes? In other words, what if we treated them like global climate change models? So global climate change models show us a likely future based on the past, not so we'll accept that future, but so we'll change it. And global climate change models make clear the difference between being true and being correct. The point of a global climate change model isn't validation. It isn't to determine how accurate any given prediction is. The point, rather, is to act in such a way that we don't have to validate these predictions. So when a model, the point, in other words, is not to produce this graph. And when a model we believe in shows a 2% increase in mean temperature, we seek to fix the world, not the model. And this should be our reaction to COMPAS. Rather than trying to fix the program, we should try to fix the world. Because what COMPAS actually shows us is how racism works through educational and employment disparities. How racism is due to institutional rather than individual bias. Right? COMPAS did get rid of individual bias, yet racism remains. Now, the problem with global climate change models, of course, is that we've known they're true for a very long time, but nothing's happened. Right? Which raises the question, do we really need more models? For whom is global climate change news? And more importantly, how can we avoid producing models that document the obvious, and that serve as alibis for inaction? So step 5, the ultimate goal is to create different worlds, different algorithms, different relations that engage the richness of relations and knowledge unfolding around us. And to do so, it takes up Kara Keeling's call to listen with others for the poetry, the refrains, and the noise a world is making. And in the book, I argue that not only the problems, but the outlines of a solution can emerge from in there. Not because technology can solve societal problems, but because technology and society are always fused together. And because the past history, as Azulai insists, isn't lost. It isn't over. It's the space of potential. If only we can unlearn our exploitative relationship to the past and engage with others, not as sources of information or sources of data, but rather as potential companions. And so the book revisits and emphasizes the populations that lie at the heart of our networks and defaults. Residents of Addison Terrace, a biracial housing project, Japanese internment camps, and married student housing at MIT, civil rights activists, slaves, unruly women workers at Western Electric, housewives in Decatur, and punishment-averse mice, to name a few. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, to return briefly to the article and housing study that coined the term homophily, the Columbia Bureau of Applied Sociological Research conducted a study of two public housing projects. One was Crafttown, a project that was cooperatively owned of some 700 white families in New Jersey, and it had to be all white because it was cooperatively owned and the laws around housing loans at that time. And Hilltown, a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in western Pennsylvania. Now, the researchers didn't assume homophily to be always true. Rather, they asked, when does homophily or heterophily happen? And they coined both these terms, homophily and heterophily. What they did find in the one article they published is that status homophily wasn't generally true except for gender and race. And Lazarsfeld and Merton argued that value homophily, the sharing of values, drove the status homophily. And to prove this, they concentrated on the over-selection of white liberals and white illiberals, where liberals meant believing in biracial housing and believing that the folks in Hilltown got along. Illiberals believed the opposites. And ambivalents didn't believe in biracial housing projects, but admitted that people of both races got along in the housing project they lived in. Now, to make this point, to show that values drove homophily, they actually threw out the responses of Black residents because they said there were too few illiberal and ambivalent Black residents with friends. So in their worldview, values were racially bounded. In their subsequent analysis and model of friendship formation, they also ignored the white ambivalence, which was actually the largest category of white residents. They never published the data for this study. And if they did, we would have seen that the over-selection of illiberals in real numbers wasn't statistically significant. The report, which was written by Merton, Patricia West, and Marie Yehuda, also revealed that Black and white residents did have friends and acquaintances of the other race. In fact, this report was used as evidence for desegregation. Now again, to come up with the term homophily, they ignored the responses of the Black residents. But without these Black residents, there would be no clean lines of connection. So they lie within the white spaces that make network connections possible. They lie in the gaps that make networks possible. And the history of networks is filled with sociological studies of others who ground our concepts and make connection possible even as they're made to disappear, such as Japanese Americans who were interned in camps during World War II. And studying these internees was crucial to the development of sentiment analysis, in particular using sentiment analysis to deal with captive communities. So these populations, these connections, they're still there. They inhabit correlation, homophily, recognition, and authenticity. We live in their enclosed and what were called experimental spaces when we live in social media. And they reside with us and touch us whenever we think with or through these concepts. So the question before us is, how might we reside with them? How might we reside with them? Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here, joined by Wendy Chun and Barry Through, Executive Director at Gray Area. Thank you guys both for being here today. This presentation comes out of Wendy's latest book. It's called Discriminating Data. And so I'm super excited to talk about that with you. I mean, before we, talk too much about some of the ideas that you presented, I mean, I still need to chew through this homophily versus heterophily in my head a little bit. But I wanted to, just start off by getting some background on the book and this research project and where it came from. It clearly comes from a longer lineage of your research practice and, other publications. And so I'd love to hear kind of the story of, how you got started on this project.
Yeah, this came right after writing the three books on the emergence of the internet. And what I started thinking about with this book in particular was why and how polarization and algorithmic defaults were operating. So, very much, how is it that what I identified as habits earlier or cultural norms get embedded within certain algorithmic structures? And more importantly, if and when they do, what can they show us so we can then change culture and society? So part of it was to say, like, why is it that recommendation systems and social media networks presume that similarity breeds connection when it's so clear around us that there are so many different types of relationships? How did that happen? How did that get amplified? And so part of it was reading some of the foundational texts in network science and digging through footnotes and archives and just really trying to understand why and how this happened. And then also to say, because there's so much that has been written, and books started in in 2016, when a lot of the news about discriminatory algorithms was coming out. And it became painfully clear that if these algorithms were discriminatory, it wasn't because they were acting incorrectly, but actually because they were functioning as they were supposed to. And so I tried to think through, what does that mean? And if they are functioning in the way they are, what can it reveal about our current state so then we can intervene and imagine a different world, very much like global climate change models. Let's treat these as probability machines based on deep fakes that will tell us what will happen if we keep automating these deep fakes.
I mean, it's certain. I mean, it's undeniable, in terms of the effect that it has on society and the way that we're seeing people on social networking platforms being organized, the way that, I'm constantly flummoxed by TikTok's algorithm because it's so sophisticated in creating and playing both sides of this in a way, like it's of creating, showing you things that are similar to something that you watched or something that your phone heard you say, and then also giving you kind of these random moments of difference, even though they're giving those exact same moments to millions of people around the world, and you kind of get this illusion of of difference, like this illusion that you're getting something that's outside of your sphere when it's clearly it's clearly planned. And I think this also, you know, hits a little bit differently. Just I think it also hits a little bit differently um, in the context of recent whistleblowing that's coming out of major social media platforms. These are things that have been by human hand seen, witnessed, promoted, continued, not stopped. And it's I mean, I want to say shocking, but it doesn't feel quite shocking anymore. But it's horrifying nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was so interesting about the whistleblower's testimony, and this goes back to the question of homophily or similarity, is that a lot of people have justified homophily in terms of people want to be around people who are like them. It's comfortable. But what's so clear is that if you put a whole bunch of people who are like together and you do this based on open secrets or stigma, what you'll have are agitated clusters of comforting rage. I mean, that when they did put limit to friends and families, it got worse. And it makes sense. And so trying to think through that and the different worlds that we live in every day is so key. I also think that what you raised that's so important is to also try to think through how do we as characters fit into the scripts that we're given? Because I'm sure you know Ben Grosser's work. And Ben was trying to play with the TikTok algorithm, like going with different identities, et cetera, trying to get something different to come out. And it was always the same. And there's an interesting way in which with personalization, sometimes we think it becomes like, as Matthew Fuller was saying, these tarot cards that emerge, right? And then we're like, oh, that person it knew this about me, so that's why it chose this. And so we read into this some sort of deeper understanding of ourselves than perhaps is there. Like we close the circuit between what's given and what we imagine we like in order to make it more and more powerful and personalized.
That's interesting. I don't know if you saw that. The end of this question is going to be something about art and creativity, but I don't know if you saw the recent viral video that was a woman who was using the TikTok algorithm's preference for motion and dance to create an activist video. So she was saying things about, overthrowing capitalism and things like that, but dancing and it caused the video to raise in the rankings there's a role for creativity here. And I'm sort of reminded and so here's the question is, I was really sort of struck by this idea of how technology is really foreclosing futures as opposed to necessarily opening them up. And one of the things that we're kind of up to at Gray Area, and you can see in the festival curation, is the role that artists play in providing a counterbalance to that. So I'm wondering, you're doing all this great research, I'm wondering in terms of either dissemination or communication to the public. And I'm also reminded of like how McLuhan contextualized artists as like distant early warning, like culturally attuned and sensorial people that are trained to inoculate the public against this kind of thing. Have you, from what you see, how do you feel art plays a role in dealing with all these things that we're talking about here?
I think art is central, but I think that not all artists are the same, and I don't think all art is the same either in doing this. And I think there's a tendency sometimes. I mean, it's really interesting because especially theorists, we tend to end with the artist that we think is really amazing, that reworks things and we love. Our covers are from them as well. And then artists turn to the theorists they love and then have them as the framework for them. And so I think there's a really interesting relationship there. But I think that what the most important art that's being produced now does is precisely make us resonate with the worlds that exist and the possibilities that exist, not simply in the future, but now. And I think that one thing that's always been really key for me is to reject both sides. Like, so on one side, remember Time Magazine, 2000, you are the person of the year, you're the internet, this is all driven by you. And then 2018, tech dude saying we destroyed the internet. We're sorry, but we are the internet, right? And you all are marionettes. So I think that between those is exactly where things lie. And for me, again, what's key is that we're characters, which means that we don't necessarily always write the script, but we're actors as well. There's ways in which the script that we have, because it's based on correlation, means that it's based on everybody else's actions. So for me, what's really profound, and this is what some of the best new media artists do, is that they make us realize that when we are looking at these little tiny screens, and we think that it's just me and the screen, there's an entire different technological structure that's in place. And that this entirely different technological and communication structure is in place is actually a point of possibility as well as a point of intervention. So I'm thinking of Ben Grosser, but also Joanna Moll's work. Mongrel's really early work was quite brilliant in their rewriting of the Photoshop interface. So in order to alter an image, you had to change the class of the individual from to middle class before you could apply the filters. And it was just a really smart hack of the Photoshop interface, but it made you think through class and different ways of operating. So I think that art has always been key, but also at the same time, we can't imagine that all art or artists are the same.
Oh, yeah. And I can tell you firsthand, they certainly are not. Pretty not sure about much, but
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad you brought up Ben Grosser. Just for the audience's awareness, Ben Grosser currently has a solo show up at Arbite Gallery in London. It's really fabulous. You can check it out online. Arbite's a great arts and tech gallery. We'll drop the link in the chat as well. Sorry, go ahead.
um, we led off this festival with a great conversation between Ben Bratton and Audrey Tang. And Audrey said some really interesting. I wish we could have, that conversation could have gone for 4 hours. Actually, it was fantastic. But I'm wondering, Audrey's position is very, it's very open source centric. Free culture, open source. And I understand certainly the role of open source in making the technology behind things transparent. That's clear. But it seems it's hard to think well, I guess, what's the question? Do you feel that that's a necessary but not sufficient step towards combating some of the, biases in technology that you're talking about, or how does it play? What way do you think about that in terms of potential responses?
I think the most profound critiques of open source that are sympathetic have come from indigenous data sovereignty folk. And as a lot of people have pointed out, the problem with the notion of open source, which is everything is freely available, is it's often been based on taking other people's stuff. Mm-hmm. Taking other people's genomes, there's a certain colonialist logic that's still embedded within the notion that everything can be an open source. And if you consider, say, some of the work by someone like Ariella Azoulay, who is trying to get us to think through history, not in terms of people being sources, but being companions. And if you think of the indigenous protocol for artificial intelligence and the focus on making kin with our machines, there's a profound difference between viewing things and people through the realm of open source and viewing them through the realm of companions.
That's so pertinent, and I think speaks to a lot of the things also that have been discussed over the course of the festival related to relationships to non-human beings and non-living beings. The elements around us shape, something that I've been saying since the beginning of the festival is that, protocol is everything. Gravity is a protocol. That's something that writes a script that defines how we walk, how we move, how we feel our bodies, which is, our sensory perception to everything. And I really like your description of people as characters, and scripts being written. I think that this is so, I think a lot of people, look at technology as being separate from their life. We hear a lot of the duality between the IRL and the URL and kind of everything in between. And people are like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg is doing this, whatever, like that's not part of my life. But, software, as not to quote the, the classic, but, software is a layer that permeates all of society. And every aspect of our lived experience is now being framed and interfaced through these kinds of constructions, through algorithmic environments. And I'm wondering I think that, you mentioned the indigenous artificial intelligence protocol, as making kin with machines is one possible way forward to escape from the tyranny of algorithmic control. What else, what other strategies or what ways can people, technologists, artists, average citizens who might feel like they don't have a role in the script, how can they do something or engage in this conversation in a way that perhaps restores agency? Is that even possible?
Yeah, that's such a huge question. There's so many different ways into it. One is to understand that if the profound effect that technology is having on our bodies and on us has everything to do with the fact that humans are creative. So if you think of things in terms of technology's influence on us in terms of our habits and our habitual way of being, habits are second nature. Habits point to the fact that humans create another nature. And so to think through our habits and the ways in which these habits are central to our negotiation and our embedding of technology. So even when we're not using an interface, it's affected us. Like if we think even how the notion of friending has changed profoundly, whether on or offline, or how we conceive of our habitual way of being, I think that's how you get at some of the ways in which technology has affected us even when we're not directly in front of our computers. But I think that because it is at the habitual level, that points to extreme human creativity, that's central. There's a way in which this is implies an embodiment in a relationship. And for me, what's always key is to think through, again, the ways in which correlation is correlation. So if your computer is operating right now, it's because it's downloading everybody else's traffic and then not and then actively deleting what's not directly addressed to you. The ways our technologies and our connections operate are by constantly opening us up to others that are then closed by these interfaces that we somehow accept as our machines. So I think part of it is to think through the richness of connection and as a way in to understanding the kinds of agency and the kinds of roles that we are already playing. And then to always realize that these things have been engineered a certain way, that we can question how things are done. We can think through not just regulation, although regulation is certainly important, not simply norms, but also, and more importantly, a poetics of engagement and being and a habit of being with our technologies.
You know, in this, not to switch, focus too much, but I think part of this, was you were mentioning earlier about the deep fake past, and that resonated with a lot of audience members, and myself as well. I mean, it's a metaphor that is not even a metaphor; it's just true. And I was grateful for that kind of framing, because I think it helps to understand how narratives have been told. We've been talking a lot at the festival as well about incorporating ancestral knowledge, incorporating history and tradition into these codified places, in ways that are meaningful and uphold them, and then by becoming a part of those ecosystems, change them purely by their presence. And you were talking a lot in the presentation about the relationship between the past and the future, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the ways that those two things converge and what that means for us as we kind of go forward in this very uncertain time.
Yeah, so right now what's most dangerous about these automatic systems is the ways in which they can, because they're built on things like eugenic understandings of the future, they seek to make the future simply repeat the past, right? Truth is consistent repetition. The problem is that the past they draw on is fundamentally a deep fake, and that repeating the deep fake becomes truth. And part of what I'm trying to understand is, again, if we view these as mirrors, like if we look at something like Compass and say, rather than let's fix the model so we have a good risk assessment tool, whatever that would be, what if we use that as a mirror for everything that's wrong with our current justice system, and then from there seek to fix the world, not the model? There's a way in which the pasts that are offered and the futures that are offered give us ways to understand the gap between what we want the future to look like and what we need the future to look like in order for it to be inhabitable, and where we're heading given the logics that we're embedded in. So I think that, again, and this goes to the question about agency, I think that the question that we should ask about a lot of these systems isn't simply let's fix these technologies, but how can we fix the world? And that gets to those questions of the ancestral knowledge and also different ways and modes of being. Because if we focus simply on fixing these technologies, then what have we fixed? Because a lot of times they're working correctly. And what they reveal is the ways in which what's accepted as the past is a deep fake. and they show us the dangers of accepting that. So I do think that thinking through this as a mirror and a point of intervention is absolutely key to moving forward.
I mean, I love I think the use of the word mirror is really key here. We're reflecting values of our society, we're reflecting the structures of our society, and thinking about, the way that interfaces affect people. That it never fails, it never escapes me that we work on desktops with files and folders in an extremely white collar work environment, and that has deeply permeated all of our subconsciousnesses, as you said, at a very habitual level.
I mean, yeah, I would say that that's probably one of the intervention points for art in this is, you have these medias that are potentially correctly revealing biases inherent in our world or injustices, and we have to keep that media that conditions and constructs our reality from just amplifying those biases into the world. And so there needs to be some intervention in the middle of that. And I think that's one of the ways arts and culture can get in the middle of that and show how to, because otherwise it would just be a feedback loop that, you have to pop out of the system in some way or another. Several years ago in 2017, we had Gene Youngblood at the festival, and this is an interesting question for you. His conclusion ended up being this idea that was secession from the broadcast. And he was just like, you got to get out, we have this homogenous media sphere, and like, you got to opt out. And then it's one of the big dialogues, that versus like, no, the only way out is through, you have to engage with this stuff and deal with technology and help, and that's the path, right? I don't know if you have a thought, like how do you exit from this conditioning sphere in a way that, besides reading Ruha Benjamin's book, reading your book, reading Safia Noble's book, there's an education portion, but I don't know if there's any way for someone that's in the middle of this system, how do you trust the information that's coming at you when it could be reflecting just like a truth, or, how do you trust it?
Well, I think that, first of all, we don't need to have the options of opt-out or change, right? I think that that's one thing we need to move away from, is if those were the two, especially because exit, if you think about the people talking about exit right now, I mean, it's...
They're out. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I set up a dichotomy for you to synthesize in the middle of.
Yeah, I think that what's key, though, when you said, how do you know what to trust? I mean, what's interesting to me right now is that a lot of people are saying, well, the issue is, people aren't trusting the institutions that they used to trust. And this is why we're in the problems we're in, right? And my point is always that democracy has depended on people questioning. And that the issue isn't that people are questioning things. The things that become dangerous is when mistrust of something like CNN leads you to completely trust Epoch Times. Like, it's not actually questioning that's the issue. It's where people land. And I think that having this constant questioning so you don't land and you're able to think through alternatives is absolutely key. And I think here, things like global climate change models, again, like they show us a future, not so that we'll accept it, but so we'll try to change it. And I think that if we look again through this lens of a probe on all these programs and say that they show us what will be unless we intervene, and we need to intervene. And here I think, again, the ways in which civil rights and civil liberties groups have come together to intervene into facial recognition technology shows us the power that can come from questioning these results that become so painfully clear when they're algorithmically expressed, so that people who before didn't seem to care about issues of racial discrimination now do. I think that this is a moment for opportunity, precisely because that gap between prediction and reality will always be there. And that gap is always the space for political and artistic intervention.
Wow. I mean, it's one thing that I think looks like a roadblock to me, and that is an issue that I've never totally been able to wiggle out from, is the opacity of all of it. You know, in your books, you talk about. Oh, sorry, there's just a truck going past my window. So sorry about that, but you know, for instance, you mentioned this earlier, the way that data packet switches in our hardware. That's a certain protocol that, as you said, you know, brings out a lot. It really opens us up in ways that we're not even aware of. You know, we can see the results of racist algorithms, and we can see the cultural impacts of, you know, a white technological frame of mind, you know, determining what these interfaces look like. But we can't understand how the algorithm works. It's almost too complex to fully comprehend. I mean, and you know, the classic example is, you know, the Google search algorithm, and you know, no single person knows how it works. It's been cobbled together and amended and changed so many different times. You know, I always have found, you know, ethnographies of software companies really rich in that sense, because most of them demonstrate that these teams are so distributed that even, you know, at any given time, one person is only working on one tiny piece, and there's no real grasp of the whole puzzle. So even for creators, even for the builders, the writers of these scripts, you know, it's very, very difficult to fully see through all of the different layers, you know, let alone the casual internet user, you know. And, you know, I think, you know, even as media theorists, we're a little bit more tuned in, but, you know, but even the average person who isn't like critically thinking about this all the time, but is just a user, you know, for their life, you know, how do we overcome this opacity? Is that something that you see? I don't know. Maybe it's not as big of a problem as I as I'm laying out, but to me, that's something that I've grappled with a lot.
I would say, do we really need to overcome the opacity? And what is at stake in thinking through, like, if we just knew exactly how these technologies work, then we could intervene into them. I mean, we don't know how many things in this world work, right? I don't know. You're opaque to me, yet we're having this conversation. And I believe that we're making interventions into each other. I think that other people like Momin Malik has really made the important point that if we consider transparency in relationship to these programs to be in terms of understanding what the machine is doing, as opposed to the relationship between the machine and what it's supposed to represent, then we've lost the battle. And then there are other people like Cynthia Rudin who are coming up with explainable machine learning models that come up with many of the same results of these more complicated ones in order to understand how they operate. And that's key as well. But I think Glissant is right. Opacity is central to relationship and relationality. And why is it that we believe our machine should be transparent to us? Like, what is it about that relationship that we fundamentally believe that these machines should be transparent when we don't expect that from the rest of the world? And if we can understand that maybe opacity isn't what's causing domination and discrimination, but there's actually something that's completely obvious that's causing discrimination and domination. I wonder sometimes when the discussion around transparency becomes an alibi for us not to deal with these other things because we're focused on this thing as if we only knew this, then we could intervene. And I also think that people overplay what we don't know. I mean, a lot of these tools, they're not rocket science. A lot of these basic mathematical concepts are well known. They're used in different ways, but it's the same way, you know, people said global climate change is going to happen like hundreds of years ago based on just how hothouse gases operate. It didn't take all these models. It was a fundamental formula that could predict this, not in all its particularities, but the fundamental trend. And so I wonder why it is that we let ourselves think that because we don't know this and we get flummoxed by the fact that we don't know this, that somehow this means that we don't act.
It seems like even rocket science isn't rocket science anymore. Like anybody can get in the game these days. Have a couple billion, you know.
That's a really refreshing approach, Wendy, and it gives me a lot of hope. It makes me feel a lot better about something that has given me, that I've been, wrestling with for a while. And I mean, it's to, to use a very, a somewhat recent example, I'm just reminded of, it's interesting in contrast with what social media companies, what technology platforms attempt to sell to you. Transparency, right? Like, you have this online profile, you have this verified identity. Now we're getting into the crypto space where blockchains verify every transaction that make it immutable and clear. And I just find that to be such an interesting tension, because as we saw in things like, Dave Eggers' The Circle, for instance, what this idea of radical transparency can actually generate, which is ultimately deeply damaging, in so many different ways. So that's
Oh, it's total. It's like the demand for real names is somehow going to make bullying go away, as opposed to realizing that actually real names makes bullying a lot more effective.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. We're
Sadly,
just
I'm looking at the clock here, and
Yeah, we're just about at it. We're a little bit over time. But I could talk to you for 6 hours, Wendy, and I really appreciate you sharing some insights from your new book. It's not quite out yet. Do you have a release date?
So I just got my author copy, so it's right here. I think it's coming out November 2nd or 5th.
discriminating data. And what's the publisher?
MIT.
MIT Press.
So
Yeah, grab a copy, guys. I can't even
Get
tell
it
you.
now before it's gone on pre-order.
as soon as I get a discount code, I'm going to send it to everyone. So.
We'll send it out to the world.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is such a great.
Thank you so much.
I wish I could be here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Wendy. I couldn't do a festival about protocol without inviting you. It would just feel so wrong. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you. See you, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you.
You too.